This is John, a husband, father, grandfather, and a career-long airline mechanic. He has a YouTube channel, and he goes live whenever there's a good break in the action. His channel can be viewed as humble and informative. This man, John Brzenk, is the most dominant athlete in any sport since the inception of sports. No disrespect to MJ, but Michael Jordan's dominance and accolades are minuscule compared to Brzenk's. We're not talking about light competition either, or one generation being weaker than the other. No, arm wrestling's Michael Jordan has been jumping from the free throw line for 40 years. He's competed against the strongest all over the world in one of the oldest and historically rich sports. His demeanor commands the respect of a war general or a samurai. When asked about his accomplishments or who's the greatest, John just keeps his mouth shut. But John Brzenk is tired of hearing that you've never heard about him before. John doesn't care if you know his name. What John wants is to retire on a beach and fly his family in whenever he wants to. But he's not ready to do that. His sport has not hit its stride. How can this be? Who's driving this ship? To understand this sport in greater detail, we need to set a new course for back in time. Eric Rusin writes the first purported evidence of arm wrestling is a complex of 39 ancient tombs in a cemetery site called Beni Hassan in Middle Egypt. Professor Anna Miragaya writes in an article, "The opening of the tombs provided at our disposal scenes of ancient Egyptian life, where among other types of combat, given in the form of wall drawings, there are images of people competing in arm wrestling." There is a historic record of arm wrestling in many cultures, but Rusin points to the renaissance of arm wrestling in Japan. He writes, "You may have seen in a movie two masters hit each other's sword and freeze in a strained pose, each trying to overpower the other. To train for this particular skill, the Japanese used to arm wrestle. It was thought that if you could overpower your opponent in an arm wrestling match, you could overpower him in a sword fight. They wrestled lying down, standing on tufts, and at the dinner table." The tradition of Japanese arm wrestling, or arm sumo, began in 1853. Commodore Matthew Perry in the U.S. Navy arrived on the shores of Japan to discuss opening ports for trade. The Japanese showed Americans sumo wrestling. As the sake flowed, the sailors became horny. Then sleeves were rolled up and the Americans introduced Japan to arm wrestling. 75 years later, a young dentist named Dr. Tetsu Satoshi Yamamoto created the first Japanese arm wrestling association in Yokohama. His gang of arm wrestling samurai were called the Yokohama Hand. Yamamoto kept strict records and detailed scientific findings as the Yokohama Hand traveled from village to village competing and spreading their sport. During his journey, Tetsu invented a series of 1,041 arm wrestling techniques, but many believe that Dr. Yamamoto only released 48 publicly. There was a 49th. The 49th technique was given away on the deathbed of Satoshi Tetsu Yamamoto, who at the time was 102 years old. He wrote the technique on a tea-stained napkin. Tetsu then folded the napkin carefully and handed it to a disciple kneeling at his side. The 49th technique was called Zombie no Tsume, or, in English, the zombie claw. Dr. Yamamoto sat up in his bed and reached out with his undefeated hand for one last arm sumo. The god of arm wrestling would demonstrate his zombie claw technique to his disciple. The disciple at his side was said to be a Gwailo, and the first American to be indoctrinated by the Yokohama Hand. What's holding this sport back? Let's pretend the UFC's Dana White and the Fertitta brothers got a wild hair and wanted to purchase the sport of arm wrestling. What are some of the things they might see to justify an investment? Anyone can play this sport. Young, old, fat, skinny, nerdy, whoever has an arm and a heartbeat can arm wrestle. But there's no money in it. If the sport's this old, why haven't the fans already glommed onto it? It's safe to play, no head traumas, easy insurance policies. You have to have a job while competing. This is tough on the family, scheduling days off for work, promotions. Even the greatest arm wrestlers have to have a job while competing. The training is really cheap. Athletes can train anywhere. They can pick up stuff, hang on to stuff, invent pulley systems. The training is as fun to watch as the competition as well. Jerseys and logos look cheap. It's better for an athlete's personal marketing to have their own attire, their own logo, style, and keep it rugged as it is. Umbrella for advertising. Arm wrestling connects to strength, clothing, international travel, hotels, food, culture, you name it. There are several major leagues. With no money, it's difficult to travel across the sea, so you have several groups of supreme athletes who rarely get to compete against each other except for the super elite. The arm wrestlers are allowed to have their own channels and independent marketing. They are excelling at this, and it seems to be a player in why the sport has gone on such an upswing lately. It's not spectator friendly. The action is boxed off. Spectators don't get much of a view except for an elevated view or a close-up view. Arm wrestlers are great on camera. It's fun to watch them compete, eat, train, or whatever they do. They're just animated athletes. Straps. The banter is occasionally funny, but it's mostly boring. The start of an arm wrestling match is an inexact science. Anywhere, anytime. 3 a.m. at the church or high noon at the cemetery. Set up a table at bars, gas station, rustic places, or even go outdoors. The sport has an amazing opportunity for broadcasting and fan interactions. Obvious steroid use is why arm wrestling is considered a strength sport. A real sport should adhere to high-level testing standards. In conclusion, we need a sport we can trust, a sport that becomes part of the routine. Arm wrestling has some holes, but it's a sport the whole crew can love, learn, and train anywhere, like a berthing of a warship, or the flight deck of a warship, or in the galley. It's a great sport, but unfortunately, it is considered a strength sport. Strength sports are filled with needle freaks. We don't want our athletes having to sacrifice the size of their penises just for temporary muscle gain. It's not the samurai code. Is this the next UFC? Absolutely. The right person will come through and bulldog this sport to where it needs to be. And old man Brzenk will get to retire on his island, fly in his family whenever he wants, and hopefully one day he flies in a journalist so he can tell the story of what was written on that napkin.